Good evening. My name is Jackson Mills. I'm a third-year student at UC Davis. I want to express my concerns with this revised version of the housing element. I believe that this updated document still does not go far enough to address housing in Davis over the next decade. The document contains relatively few additions from the last version that was rejected by HCD, and those additions are not solid guarantees that more housing will get built. This document relies on a possible ballot measure in 2 years to reform Measure J that will disenfranchise students who live on campus. It also overestimates the chances that projects will get built. Considering the track record of projects like Nishi and Trackside, which have been stuck in litigation after approval for half a decade or more, the claim that in this housing element that any project has a 100% chance of being built is simply not true. I also cannot stand here and talk about the need for more housing without talking about the climate crisis. I know that there are beliefs of some that not building any more housing is key to solving climate change, but it has been empirically shown over and over that higher densities equals fewer carbon emissions per person and also overall. This also makes sense logically, as putting a lot of housing where people work and shop and play means that they can take transit or walk or bike instead of driving. Upzoning and infill development is key to combating the climate crisis, but this housing element does not contain enough of these commitments, and I fear that Davis will not meet its climate targets without them. I would personally like to see streamlined approval of all housing projects that meet Davis's zoning requirements, the elimination of mandatory parking minimums citywide, and the creation of an affordable housing ordinance that is realistic and leads to the construction of much more affordable housing units in the city. With these inclusions, the Davis housing element would likely put Davis on a path toward a more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous future, but it does not include enough of these provisions, and I worry for this city's future as a result. I know this city and its leaders are capable of doing more, and I sincerely hope we'll see that over the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you to our public commenter. Next, please.
Good evening. My name is Frances Haydock, and I'm a fourth-year student at UC Davis. And I'm here tonight because I believe that the updated housing element does not go nearly far enough to alleviate the housing crisis that students like me are experiencing. In the 4 years I've been a student at UC Davis, I've repeatedly witnessed the mad rush to sign housing contracts in January and February, which is nearly 9 months before students are even able to move into these residences. This is absurd. And it happens because there is such a lack of housing in Davis that students are forced to sign leases early, compete viciously with each other for the cheapest and most affordable rent, and subsequently stress about not being able to find affordable housing in their price range. The situation is simply untenable and should not be allowed to continue. Students, just like everybody else in Davis, deserve the basic dignity of 4 walls and a roof over our heads without having to worry about whether we have enough money to both pay rent and eat this month. Just because we only happen to live in this community for about 4 years does not mean that we should be treated as less than. This is why the updated housing element proposed by the City Council is not enough. We all know that the City of Davis is historically unfriendly to new development, as exemplified by the Childs Ranch and Nishi projects being approved with no real movement on development of either of these projects. And yet, the plan we see before us tonight relies on these projects to meet their needed inventory numbers. This is unrealistic, and the plan should be amended to mandate more development. Further, in order to combat the dual climate and housing crises, we must make it as easy as possible to build housing on open land as well as in infill areas. This means that we cannot allow these developments to hinge solely on voter approval. If we allow housing developments to be held hostage by radical no-growth residents, Davis will be abandoning its moral duty to house all of its residents and to drastically reduce its climate impact. This is unforgivable. Thus, the Council should update the housing element to ensure we are actually addressing these dual crises and make Davis into a community where everybody can thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, public commenter. Next, please.
Good evening. My name is Katie Borgeson, and I'm a first-year student at UC Davis. I believe the housing element does not provide enough for the Davis community and the struggles to find housing for Davis students. As a first-year student, I'm experiencing my first rush to get housing. Without a current lease, I am starting from scratch to find an apartment that's affordable and available. I've reached out to many complexes in the area, and I'm struggling to find any available apartments that aren't full from current residents or don't have a lottery system for new residents, requiring me to bet on whether I will have housing for next year. The housing options have become so limited for students that we struggle to find anywhere that meets our needs. We cannot ignore the large number of students who must search for housing each year. A better housing element is crucial for the residents, permanent and temporary, of the City of Davis. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Christopher Reyes-Acosta. I'm a fourth year at UC Davis, and I'd like to talk about my issues with the housing element. So elements in the housing element, such as the passing of a city ballot measure next year, as well as the fact that new housing is not guaranteed to be built, takes away from our ability to find secure and affordable housing. We cannot already live on-campus housing because those units tend to be much more expensive than the ones off campus. So if we can't find housing off campus or on campus, we turn to different, more extreme measures. So last Tuesday night at my apartment complex, I saw about 30 to 40 students, mostly first-year students, with blankets, sleeping bags, and tents sitting in front of our complex office, waiting for the office to open the next morning in order to secure a lease for the next academic year. They were sleeping there, or some didn't even sleep, since about 6 p.m. the night before. Some of them I recognized as friends and offered them food, a bathroom, as well as my apartment to sleep in the night, but they chose not to and decided to wait it out the entire night. And so when the office finally opened the next morning, many of them sadly could not sign a lease for the next year. Only about half, maybe even less, were able to get a unit. So the fact that we have to turn to these sorts of measures and not even succeed in getting housing is appalling. So I implore that this housing element be updated to meet our housing demands so that we can secure affordable housing for our college years. Thank you.
Thank you, the public commenter. Next, please.
Hello, council members. My name is Sathvik, and I'm a first year at UC Davis. I wanted to share a personal experience that many UC Davis students face. Last week, my friends and I camped out in the cold 2 times in front of 2 different apartment complexes, only to fail to secure a lease. Even though we came more than 16 hours in the cold, hopped up on caffeine before the lease office would open, we were beat out by those before us. This isn't Berkeley, Santa Cruz, or Santa Barbara. It's Davis. Securing second-year housing should not be a stressful add-on to the stresses that students already face. I'm concerned that this housing element is inadequate to fix the crisis in a timely manner. Students are scared that the projects outlined in the housing element will end up unbuilt, like Nishi and University Commons. On top of that, the optimistic fund estimates that the element contains based on are the more than hopeful ballot propositions, which students have no influence on, and the state funds, which are drying up soon. The city's response to the state's very reasonable mandate should not be to skirt it, but to find developable parcels along with needed upzoning, allowing those who want to build. With an RHNA requirement lower than West Sacramento and Woodland, and being considerably wealthier than both municipalities, we should make sure that we build the promised housing. While you may not see or hear from many students today about the intricacies of the housing element, we are paying attention, and your actions affect us more than anyone. Simply put, I think we can do better for our students, for our climate, and for our housing crisis.
Thank you to the public commenter. Next, please.
Hi, good evening, City Council. My name is Francisco, and I'm a freshman at UC Davis. This January, my friends and I have spent a lot of our time looking for housing for next year. And over the course of the last few weeks, we've discovered all the problems facing the city in regards to housing. Searching for this housing has become extremely competitive to the point where apartments have already begun filling up. And this is before we're even halfway through our school year. It's become evident to us that there's a very limited supply of housing in Davis to the detriment of the city and its residents. It's important to me that the city fixes the problems with the current housing element instead of providing false promises. We need to add more commitment to build more housing to sustain the growing student and non-student population of Davis. Housing is not a luxury, it's a necessity, and we should consider it a higher priority. And so I feel it's imperative that we engage in pro-growth policies that develop the land that we have into sustainable and affordable housing that'll help everybody in our community. Thank you.
Thank you to the public commenter. Next, please.
Good evening. My name is Zayden. I'm a second-year student here at UC Davis, and I'm the executive director for the UC Davis College Democrats. I'm here this evening because I believe the currently proposed housing element is frankly inadequate in addressing Davis's growing affordable housing needs. While it's important for the City Council to quickly pass a suitable housing element to meet the state standards, we must recognize when these propositions simply do not go far enough. Not only as a student, but as a member of this community, I've experienced and watched as my friends and classmates go through the tedious and frankly ridiculous process of finding housing and landing a lease that is within their price range. From students literally camping out in front of the Almondwood apartments in hopes of getting a lease, to many of our housing prospects for the next year being tied to arbitrary housing lotteries, students understand the need for affordable housing, frankly, better than any community in this city. It's why we're here today to speak for a more ambitious housing element, because the current proposal ties too much of the city's future housing projects to conditional and vague goals. What we need are concrete proposals, not ballot propositions that frankly don't necessarily guarantee us anything. Especially in a city that has a history of rejecting new developments, a fact exemplified by the Trackside and Nishi projects. The housing element does include, however, the housing element does include language relating to working with UC Davis, but is almost entirely dependent on the UC seeking funding from the state. Not only is this goal entirely beholden to the outcome of politics, it comes far too late considering the sheer amount of units the campus would need to build to reach 100% of their goal, especially in a political climate that is seeking to reduce spending. It's time that we learn from our lessons as a city and pass a housing element that actually addresses our housing and development needs. Let's get to work.
Thank you to the public commenter. Next, please. While I appreciate your enthusiasm, just a reminder that we try not to show signs of approval or disapproval in council chambers. So thank you for your enthusiasm. I appreciate it, but just out of decorum, we respectfully ask that. Thank you. Go for it.
All right, good evening. I'm Stephen, a fourth-year UC Davis student. I'm also a student senator elected to serve and represent students in UC Davis's AUCCD student government. I'm here tonight because as a student senator, I've heard the worries and experiences of my fellow UC Davis students around securing housing. Just one example. The apartment complex I currently live at signed new leases this past week at 8 a.m. in the morning. A student told me that they and their friends began waiting at 10 p.m. the night before to secure an apartment lease. This is the consequences of housing being treated as a commodity. Students must camp out and wait in the cold so they can get an apartment they afford. With this in mind, the revised housing element does not adequately address the student needs that I see in this city. The housing element includes housing units from the projects that have not made progress and units from the University Commons project, despite announcements that no housing will be built on the site. I also want to express grave concerns about the housing element's reliance on ballot measures to ensure housing needs are met. As a student representative, it is important for me to listen to student voices and ensure they have a say on issues that impact them. It is unclear whether a ballot measure on an issue as critical as housing will incorporate student voices. Not all students may be registered to vote, but all students are affected by this city's housing policies. On behalf of my fellow students, I urge the council to address these shortcomings in the housing element and add more affordable housing units to the housing element. Thank you.
Thomas Howe, agenda item number 5, the revised housing element. I'd just like to say that I think we need more than just promises from the housing element. I don't think it necessarily goes far enough to get Davis enough houses. We need more upzoning and density to get more houses. And ideally, we should revise this revised housing element to get what we really need. House himself, Hugh Lloyd from hit show House MD. Only then can we satisfy our housing needs. Thank you for your time.